I recently finished my challenge to make and publish a game in 4 weeks, so let's take a look at how it went. Last week I finished making the base of the game, with a weapon system and some basic enemies, so now I'm going to spice things up and release it for everyone to play. Just before we start, if this video hits 50 likes, I'm going to keep working on this game and posting more content like this, so if that's something you'd like to see, or you just want to support me as a small YouTuber, chuck me a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and share this with your friends because it really makes a big difference to me. Right now, when a zombie dies, it literally just explodes, which isn't what happens in real life, and yes, I got that information firsthand. To fix that, I needed to make a death animation, but the problem is that my animation skills are essentially non-existent, even worse than my modelling. Luckily for me, Mixamo happened to have a great death animation, and also a sweet download button next to it. Next I added jump pads which could lead to some interesting level design in the future. I don't have any concrete plans yet, but they were also pretty fun to mess around with. With the basics done, it was time to make some maps so that you could actually play the game, because, that'd be pretty cool. I started by brainstorming level ideas, and this is what I came up with, which is totally not ripped off from something I saw on the internet. With the planning done, the next step was to actually build it. I'd heard a lot about Pro Builder, and tried using it at first, but gave up after around half an hour when I just had a big square. The only other option was to go back to Blender, and I ended up painting the map in random colours again to try to hide my terrible modelling skills. I had a really annoying problem where part of the map was just super dark, and after a couple of hours I realised that changing the background of my texture from black to white fixed the problem. The next step was to add enemies and pickups to the map, and that went pretty smoothly with absolutely no problems at all. With all of that out of the way, I had to come up with some kind of unique mechanic for my game, because there's already a million different generic first-person shooters out there, and I didn't want to just copy an existing game. I started by looking at past game jam themes and picking out things that I thought could be viable, then brainstormed how I could link them to my game. In the end, this is what I came up with. The player has two vision states in which they can see and interact with different things. For example, in state A, they can see and shoot enemies, but in state B, they can see weapons, ammo, and health pickups. The catch would be that enemies can still damage the player when they're in state B. Now it was time to implement that, which I estimated would take around half an hour max. After messing around with it, I got the right items to turn invisible at the right time, but the player could still interact with invisible objects, which wasn't what I wanted. The weapon that the player was holding also turned invisible with the other weapons, which wasn't ideal. However, with yet more code, it all worked and I'm pretty happy with the end result. While testing the game, I realised that with my massive brain I had made the player able to jump onto platforms without using a jump pad, so I lowered the player's jump force so they can't just hack their way through the level. I also added the ability to switch weapons using the mouse wheel and health packs for the player to pick up. Some other bugs I had to fix were the sniper hitting items that it shouldn't be able to hit, such as health packs, and the shooting being super inaccurate when up close. With the health packs in the game, the next step was to add ammo pickups, but to have an ammo pickup in the game, I first need an ammo pickup model. Luckily, this went better than my last attempt at modelling, and next I wrote the code for the ammo pickup, then remade the models, one for light ammo and one for heavy ammo. The game dev journey isn't a game dev journey without a ton of bug fixing, so I spent a day fixing bugs like the player damaging itself when shooting, being able to shoot when dead, and enemies blocking the doors when they died. After that, I made a UI so that the player knows how much ammo they have left, what interactable object they're currently facing, and did some maths to fix the reloading calculations. To cap off week 3, I added ragdolls to the enemies. I've never actually made a ragdoll before, so I just went for it and since I had absolutely no clue what I was doing, I went to my man Brackies and with his help got it working pretty well. That concluded week 3, and here's some footage from the end of it. And now it was finally time for the final week of the challenge. If you've ever played a game before, you've probably noticed that it has a main menu. Since my game doesn't currently have a main menu, it probably can't be called a game yet, which is a bit of an issue. I didn't want to just have a boring static screen, so I spent an hour or so setting up the background, which was essentially just the level that I had made, with the camera sitting in the corner of one of the rooms. For some reason, I also decided to make a triangle in Photoshop and put that one on the screen. Don't ask me why, because it looks really bad, but after spending around 3 hours on it, I just didn't want to scrap it. Next I had to come up with a title, which I always have a ton of trouble doing. Just to get something on the screen, I called it Life is Short, but if you have any other suggestions, drop a comment below and there's a pretty good chance that I'll change it. While you're down there, make sure to slap like and subscribe. You might have noticed that changing the resolution in the options menu didn't actually do anything in the Unity editor, so to test it out properly and make sure it works, I decided to build the game. For some reason, every time I tried building the project, I just got a ton of errors, and even after hours of research, I couldn't figure out what was wrong. At this point, I thought about giving up, because if I can't build the project, I can't release it and the challenge would be failed anyway. Luckily, after many long hours, I stumbled across an article which talked about IL2 CPP and mono. I switched the setting and it worked! With the build working, I could test out the main menu and it all seemed to be working pretty well. The next step was to make the def screen. This was way easier than I expected, and I just used the def overlay that I downloaded earlier for this project, then added some buttons for the player to restart and go back to the main menu. I also made a quick level loading screen so that the game doesn't just freeze when loading a level, which I thought was pretty nice. For the background, I literally took a screenshot of the game, and that just about finished the level loader. Currently, the triangle in the main menu looks like garbage, so I opened it in Photoshop. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I did manage to make a new triangle which looks slightly better. I also made the buttons expand when you hover over them to make the main menu feel more responsive. With the menu basics done, it was time to make the weapons feel better and more realistic to use. The first step in doing this was of course to add recoil. Now, like many other things, I've never actually done this before, so it took me way longer than it should have, and I got some dodgy results along the way. I mean, like, what on earth is that? It's literally hurting my eyes to watch. Now, when you look at my modelling, you probably want to throw up, so I asked one of my friends to help me model the shotgun for me, and, well, judge for yourself, it looks absolutely sick, but unfortunately, I had no idea how to use it as a weapon in the game, because it simply has so many parts. After messing around and nearly breaking his model several times, I fixed the bugs, and it's actually really fun to play with now. The player's weapon sometimes clips through the walls, which isn't very much like real life. So instead of actually fixing the problem like a normal person would, I just made a separate camera for the weapon and the environment, then layered the weapon camera first so that the player's weapon doesn't appear to clip through the wall. The next issue was that sometimes bullets seem to penetrate right through an enemy and hit the one behind it. The fix was pretty easy, although also pretty hacky, so I'm just crossing my fingers and hoping that it doesn't break in the future. I also edited the shooting mechanic to make the accuracy more realistic. The next animation I had to make was an idle animation, which I thought wouldn't be too hard, but I slowed down the animation, but it still looked so bad that I decided to scrap it in the end. I also edited the recoil animations to make them less extreme so it looks more realistic when shooting. Now, have you ever noticed that when you're carrying a heavy bag, you move slower than when you're carrying a lighter bag? If you haven't, that happens because, well, a heavier bag is harder to carry. To add this concept into the game, I made different guns modify the player's speed when carried, so that the lighter the weapon is, the faster the player will move. The effect is pretty hard to notice, but I think when I add more stuff to the game and make it faster paced, it will become more noticeable. While playing, I realised that the vignette and the camera shake that I added in the last video had disappeared, and I had no idea how that happened. Anyway, once I added them back in again, it looked and felt much better to play. Finally, the last thing missing was an endless level, because I had originally set out to make an endless game. So I started working on the level, and somehow managed to make the base of it pretty quickly. I didn't like the default material, so I opened up Paint 3D to try to make a tile texture before realising that it was simply really bad. so use Photoshop instead. Honestly, it looked far better than I had been expecting it to look, and I thought it matched the sci-fi look that I had been going for pretty well. After adding post-processing to the level, it looked even better, and I have to say I was really happy with the end result. I messed around with different tile colours, and I also really liked the reverse black and white tile, but decided to stick with the first one I made for now. Let me know in the comments below what colour tiles you'd like to see in the next level, and while you're down there, remember to slap like. Now while I was happy with the textures, the level was looking pretty bland, so I spiced things up by adding floating platforms, a UI, the player, weapons, etc., and now it looks much better. It's also a bit hard to move around the level right now, but editing the movement will take a long time to do, so I'll save that for later. With the endless level complete, the next important thing to do was make an enemy spawner, because without one, it wouldn't be an endless game, unless you count just standing and staring at walls forever, as a game. But before that, I added proper recoil to the shotgun, which allows you to do some pretty fun rocket jumps and move around the level more easily. Spent a couple of hours bug fixing and removed the bullet trail from the weapons because I thought it looked a ton better without them there. I also made the hexagonal platforms only visible to the player in one vision state, and I still haven't decided whether I'll keep it or not, but I think that concept of making the player choose between movement options and seeing enemies could lead to some interesting gameplay down the road. Now it was time to get working on making the enemy and the item spawners. I started off with just a single spawner which spawns a random item after a random amount of time, then split that into two scripts to give myself more control over the behaviour of spawning items and enemies. Making the enemy spawner was actually really difficult because I wanted to make the system as flexible as possible while keeping it simple. In the end, I had to learn about asynchronous tasks, and while I still have nowhere near a decent understanding of them, I managed to get the spawner working, and I'm going to leave it as it is. I also made the enemies destroy themselves a few seconds after they die to stop the arena from filling up with dead bodies, which actually lets you play the game. The item spawner was way easier to make, and I just added some rules to stop it from spawning items too close together. I also made a system for me to classify each item as either common, rare, epic, or legendary, and it would change the likelihood of spawning each item depending on its rarity. Since there aren't very many items in the game yet, a ton of pistols and other common items spawn, and you don't get many other items, but once I add more items it should be more interesting. With the spawners mostly done, the vision mechanic is becoming far more important now, as you have to keep switching back and forth to make sure you don't run out of ammo and health, but can still kill the enemies. Finally, it was time to make the score counter. I made every zombie you kill give you 50 points, and every zombie cop killed give you 100 points. I also made every minute survived 60 points, so that you're rewarded 1 point for every second you survive for anyone who can't back. I also decided not to make a UI for it in the game so that the player doesn't get distracted, which was totally not just an excuse because I was running out of time. The final UI elements I added were a timer to see how long you had survived, a countdown timer which shows the time left until the next wave starts, and a score adder uppery thingy on the dev screen. I also redid the main menu to make it look better and suit the new level, added a more proper about page, and redid the loading screen. On the last day, I found an amazing background music pack on the Unity Asset Store, learnt about Unity's mixer and adaptive soundtracks, and put together my own basic adaptive soundtrack which changes depending on how much health the player has left. I also added a pause menu, fixed the enemy spawn points, and that wrapped up the final day of the challenge. While I was playtesting, I found a bunch of minor bugs, and since I don't exactly want to release a super buggy version of my work, I did end up going over the deadline by 2 days. Anyway, here are some clips of the end result of this challenge. Remember, if this video hits 50 likes, I'll keep working on this project and creating more content like this, so smash the like button if you haven't already, and don't forget to subscribe. If I continue, I'm thinking of adding features like high scores, online leaderboards, and improving gameplay feedback and UI design. If you have any requests or suggestions of what you would like to see next, feel free to drop them in the comments below, because my main aim is to turn this into a community developed game. If you're still here, thanks for increasing my average retention time, and I'll see you in the next one.